Welcome to next anatomy. Topic of discussion: spinal cord. When we talk about the little intro of the nervous system, it will be classified into a peripheral nervous system and a central nervous system, which divides into brain and spinal cord. So now the spinal cord is developing and derived from the central nervous system. So when you see the brain, and the further steps will be the brainstem, which includes midbrain, pons, and the medulla. Medulla oblongata itself will be the descent continuation into the vertebral column as the spinal cord. Spinal cord is the lower elongated part of the central nervous system. Spinal cord is cylindrical and anteroposteriorly it is flattened. And when you see the measurements, it will be male 45 and female 42 centimeters long in length and weighs about 30 grams in weight. Our important point to be remembered is the extent. As discussed, it is coming down the continuation of the medulla oblongata. After I exit the foramen magnum of the skull, so now we initiate the vertebral column from cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, coccygeal vertebrae. When we are into the vertebral column of every vertebrae, I start off from the C1 upper border of the posterior arch and until to the L1 level. So ease of to remember, from C1 to L1 will be my extent of the spinal cord. From L2 to the tip of the coccyx, what happens is in the next sessions we'll talk about the filum terminale. So now this is the picture. You could able to see the lower continuation of the medulla oblongata itself will continues as the spinal cord, and now they were been covered by the meninges. And you could able to see the group of nerves that are being exiting out through the spinal cord. And I could able to name them as the brachial plexus. In the later words, we'll talk about the cervical enlargement. You could able to see every individual segment, the spinal nerves are emerging outside. At the level of L1 level, the lower tapering extremity. So at the L1 level, the spinal cord will becomes a cone shape like appearance called as conus medullaris. From the conus medullaris, we could able to see the descent extent. I'm going to call them as the filum terminale. And then on either side of the filum terminale, you could able to identify the L2 onwards to coccygeal nerve roots. Every spinal nerve, that is lumbar L2 to L5 sacral, all 5 coccygeal one pair. They forms a bunch around the filum terminale. And I could able to name them as Cauda, equina. Cauda means tail and equinus means horse, which appears like a horse tail. As said, they consist of lower 4 lumbar, 5 pairs of sacral, and 1 pair, total 10 pairs of the lower spinal nerves. This is the photograph where you could able to see from the conus medullaris. You could able to see, I'm trying to keep up the dotted lines. You could able to see the filum terminale until to the tip of the coccyx. On either side, you could able to see the descent of bunch of the nerves that are been descend down. I'm going to name them together as Cauda, equina. So you could able to see very clearly here. So this will be our filum terminale and the Cauda equina, and the lower tapering end itself, I'm going to call them as the conus medullaris. And when we study the spinal cord, there are some peculiarities you are supposed to remember. Mainly, first you are supposed to know the difference between the vertebrae and the spinal nose. So the bony vertebrae or cervical vertebrae are 7 in number, thoracic or 12 in number, lumbar 5, sacral 5, coccygeal 4. Total we had 33 vertebrae that you might have studied during your skeletal system. But in the nervous system now, when you read about the spinal nerves, I have 8 pairs of spinal nerves, 12 thoracic pairs, 5 lumbar pairs, 5 sacral pairs, and 1 coccygeal pair. So total I'll be having 31 pairs of spinal nerves. When you know these spinal nerves or what is the thing I could able to remember. So during the descent of the spinal cord, you could able to see some two enlargements you could able to identify as cervical enlargement and lumbar enlargement. So from the cervical level C5, C6, C7, C8 and T1, they constitutes brachial plexus. So what are these enlargements? First of all, they are the large motor neurons which gets enlarged and they form a group of nerves. So all these nerves will supply to the upper limb and you entitle and study as a brachial plexus in the upper limb. Same like as you study in the lower limb as a lumbar plexus L2, L3, L4, L5, S1, S2 and S3. Yes, together like I name them as lumbar or lumbosacral plexus. So these are some few words which you would be able to remember about the enlargements. Same like as when you study the external features. Always when you study in the CNS, you have to remember anterior aspect and posterior aspect. So I could able to remember anterior aspect, I could able to remember them as fissures and posterior aspect as a sulci. So in the anterior aspect, you could able to see one anterior median fissure on either side. You could able to see right and left anterolateral fissures. Same likewise, when you see in the posterior aspect, you could able to see posterior median sulcus. Same likewise over here, posterior intermediate and the posterolateral sulcus on either side. That I'll be showing you in the photograph so that you will understand it very clearly. You could able to see in this photograph at every level, I could able to see on either side the pair of spinal nerves that are being emerging outside. And then when you see the anterior median fissure is very deep, why it was being deep, it encloses in the last when you study the blood supply, they were being supplied by anterior spinal artery. Almost anterior two-thirds section of the spinal cord will be supplied by the anterior spinal artery and also the posterior median sulcus, which is faint longitudinal group. And once you know the features on sulci, let me take you to the photograph. Here you will be able to see from the lower end of the medulla to the tip almost to the L1 level. So now this will be my conus medullaris. So now I'm trying to keep the dotted lines in the middle. You could able to see anterior median fissure which lodges the anterior spinal artery. And try to see on either side parallelly. You could able to see two lines were been drawn over here. So you could able to see those faint sulci. I could able to call them on the right side and left side anterolateral sulcus. Same format you could able to see on the posterior aspect also. Instead of calling posterior median fissure, I could able to name them as posterior median sulcus. Same like as how I had anterolateral sulcus. I'll be also having posterolateral sulcus, extremely lateral most aspects on either side. So between posterior median and posterolateral, I'll be having posterior intermediate sulcus. So easy to remember here, I could able to see 3. Here I could able to identify 5 in number. So later after L1 conus medullaris, I could able to see the descent of as discussed. So now this is called as Filum terminale until to the tip of the coccyx. And spinal cord is covered by meninges, dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater. So our duty is to remember that until to the S2 level, at this level you could able to see I was being covered by the jura mater. I'm going to call them as phylum terminale. So later on when you study the modifications, you will learn and you will study one word Inside the dura mater, this extent I am going to call them as Filum terminale internum, 15 centimeters long. After I exit S2 onwards, after exiting dura mater, I am going to call the other modification of Filum terminale. So I'm going to name them as Filum terminale externum. So now this one will be Filum terminale internum. This will be the Filum terminale externum. So internum is 15 centimeters long, externum is 5 centimeters long. Together it is 20 centimeters long in length. So as discussed in the previous slide, anteromedian fissure, you could able to identify very clearly the blood vessel which supplies to the spinal cord, that is the in the anterior median fissure, that is the anterior spinal artery is passing through. Same likewise, we could able to see the enlargements as discussed, cervical enlargements and lumbar enlargements. You could see in this previous. In this photograph, you could able to identify the enlargement, cervical enlargement and the lumbar enlargement. So now when you study the external features, as I just discussed about fissures on sulci. In fissures on sulci, you see anteromedian fissure and right and left anterolateral sulci in the anterior aspect. Posteromedian, postero-intermediate, and posterolateral sulcuses in the posterior aspect. And we already spoke about the attachment of the spinal nerves. So we have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. As discussed, we had cervical 8 pairs, thoracic 12 pairs, lumbar 5, sacral 5, and coccygeal 1 pair. Then next we spoke about the enlargement, cervical enlargement and the lumbar enlargement, which forms the lumbar plexus in the lower down, and the higher up it forms the brachial plexus. And then even we spoke about the Cauda equina. From the L1 level, I descend down as the Filum terminale. On either side of Filum terminale, we could able to call the group of nerves called as Cauda equina. So these are some external features which we studied up till now. And then when you study each and every spinal now, when you see the cross section, so now this will be your anterior median fissure, this will be my posterior median sulcus, so that I am going to make up my whole spinal cord. And I can call them as the anterior aspect or the ventral aspect. Posterior aspect are called as what the dorsal aspect. And from every aspect, we could able to see the anterior spinal root and the posterior root. They descend out. Both will meet each other and they are going to form an individual spinal nerve. And the anterior spinal root will carry all the motor fibers and the posterior aspect will carry all the sensory fibers. So I can be able to name them as anterior motor root and the posterior spinal root. Later on, when you study tracks, you could be able to see the posterior root is also having a posterior ganglion. Do listen again and again so that you'll understand the class. Stay tuned and try to see you all back in the next session. Like, share, and subscribe to next anatomy.